When we look at this history, images of great invasions like those of the Romans and the Normans come to mind. But sometimes the biggest and most decisive changes came not from foreign invaders, but from internal civil wars. It was these wars, fought between the country's own inhabitants, brother against brother, that changed the course of England's future forever. These were not just minor skirmishes, but brutal battles for the throne of England that tore the entire country apart. And at the heart of all these bloody events are certain battles that not only decided the victor of the day, but also wrote the history for many centuries to come. One such moment, one such decisive turning point, was the Battle of Bosworth. This happened more than 500 years ago. Fought in the fields of Leicestershire in August 1485, this battle proved to be the final and dramatic chapter of the long civil war known as the Wars of the Roses.
The name Wars of the Roses is itself a later invention popularized by the famous author Sir Walter Scott. In reality, it was not a single war, but a complex and brutal series of civil wars, spanning decades between two rival branches of the royal family. On one side was the House of York, whose symbol was the white rose, and on the other, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was the red rose. These were merely symbols. Soldiers on the battlefield did not always wear these emblems, and loyalty shifted so quickly that it was sometimes difficult to tell who was on which side. This war engulfed England for nearly 30 years, resulting in constant instability and violence. The Battle of Bosworth was not the first major battle in this series. Bloody battles like Towton had been fought before it, which is called the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. After that, the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury sealed the victories of the Yorkist king, Edward IV. The Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 was a true disaster for the Lancastrians. Their heir, Prince Edward, was killed, and key leaders were either executed or imprisoned. Queen Margaret of Anjou, who had long been the driving force of the Lancastrian cause, finally became Edward's prisoner. And then, quite conveniently for Edward, the imprisoned Lancastrian king, Henry VI, died mysteriously in the Tower of London a few weeks later. Officially, the cause was given as grief and melancholy, but no one believed this lie. This death solidified Edward IV's grip on the throne like a rock, and it seemed that the Yorkists had finally won the war. People began to hope for peace and stability. Edward IV was seen as a charismatic and capable ruler. He was a strong leader who established relative peace and promoted trade. He included London's merchants and bankers in his administration, which was a modern step at the time.
He also rewarded loyalty handsomely. He not only gave his close friend William Hastings important positions, but also showered him with honors and estates. But his personality also had flaws. He was fond of luxury and gluttony. One historian writes that he used emetics at feasts so he could eat more. His relationships with women were also notorious. He was also a ruthless ruler. Whenever anyone attempted to rebel, he crushed them with an iron fist. He had sent a clear message that challenging the Yorkist government meant losing everything. But the irony was that while the king established peace in the country, a poisonous tension was brewing within his own family, among his own brothers. The tension between his two younger brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was at its peak. The dispute was ostensibly about inheritance, but the roots ran deeper. Clarence had rebelled against his brother Edward before, and now he felt insecure.
He could see that his younger brother, Richard, who had always been loyal, was gaining power and influence. Finally, in 1477, Edward grew tired of his brother Clarence's conspiracies and had him arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. Then, through a bill in Parliament, he was sentenced to death without a formal trial. Richard's silence throughout this affair was significant. Edward could not have taken this step without his tacit consent. With Clarence's elimination and the presence of Edward's two young sons, the issue of succession seemed resolved. But then, in April 1483, everything suddenly changed. At only 41 years of age, the apparently healthy King Edward IV fell gravely ill after a fishing trip. Before dying, he willed that his 12-year-old son, Edward V, would be king, and his loyal brother, Richard of Gloucester, would run the government as Lord Protector until the new king came of age. On his deathbed, he begged all the nobles to remain united, but this plea vanished into thin air immediately after his death.
The death of Edward IV on April 9, 1483, created a political vacuum that immediately gave rise to mistrust and conspiracies. Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her family tried to seize power. Their plan was to bring the young Edward V to London immediately for his coronation, to form a regency council where Richard would be rendered powerless. But Richard, who was in the north, was not ready for this game. He moved swiftly south with the support of powerful men like the Duke of Buckingham and William Hastings.
He intercepted the young king's entourage near Northampton and arrested key Woodville figures, including the Queen's brother, Earl Rivers. Later, all of them were beheaded at Pontefract Castle on Richard's orders without any trial. It was a brutal and decisive move. Hearing this news, a terrified Queen Elizabeth Woodville took refuge in Westminster Abbey with her younger son, the 10-year-old Duke of York. Richard arrived in London with the young king, who was now practically his prisoner.
He had Parliament approve him as Lord Protector. At this point, it is difficult to say if he had already planned to seize the throne, but the speed of events suggested that this intention was rapidly strengthening. The biggest obstacle in his path was Lord Hastings, a loyal friend of Edward IV, who would not betray his son at any cost. Richard knew that Hastings would obstruct his plan, so it was necessary to remove him from the way.
On June 13, 1483, during a council meeting at the Tower of London, Richard suddenly flew into a rage and accused Hastings of treason. Armed men entered, dragged Hastings outside, and beheaded him right there on a wooden block. This execution without trial shook everyone. Richard justified it by claiming Hastings was conspiring against him, but he offered no proof.
Many historians believe that at this point, Richard realized he had gone too far and there was no way back. The only way to keep himself safe was to seize the throne. 3 days later, on June 16th, Richard sent a delegation to have the younger prince moved from Westminster Abbey to the Tower of London in the name of protection. The two princes were never seen in public after that summer. Their mysterious disappearance remains one of history's greatest secrets. After this, Richard's supporters began a propaganda campaign. On June 22, a sermon at St. Paul's Cathedral claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was illegitimate because he had previously made a secret contract of marriage with another woman. This weak legal argument meant that his children, including Edward V, were illegitimate and could not inherit the throne. This cleared the way for Richard. After a formal request in which he initially showed reluctance, Richard was declared King Richard III on June 26th.
But what happened to the two princes? There is no concrete evidence in history that Richard ordered their murder, but circumstantial evidence points to him. Many of Richard's loyal Yorkist followers rebelled against him, which suggests they believed Richard had killed the princes. As long as those two boys were alive, Richard's throne was not secure. This usurped throne did not bring Richard stability. Instead, it poisoned his reign.
There was intense hatred against him, especially in the south. He solved this problem by bringing his loyal supporters from the north and appointing them to key positions in the south, which further increased resentment among the local nobility. Then personal tragedies also struck him. In April 1484, his only legitimate son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly. Less than a year later, in March 1485, his wife, Queen Anne Neville, also died, likely from tuberculosis. These deaths fueled a storm of rumors.
It was said that Richard had poisoned his wife to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. These rumors were baseless, but they deepened the image of a ruthless and perhaps cursed king. Meanwhile, the last hope of the Lancastrian cause, Henry Tudor, was living in exile in France. His claim to the throne was very weak, connected through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, to an illegitimate royal line. He had spent 14 years of his life in exile in Brittany.
Richard's seizure of the throne gave him an opportunity. He attempted to invade England in 1483 in conjunction with the Duke of Buckingham's rebellion, but severe storms prevented him from landing his troops. Buckingham's rebellion failed and he was captured and executed.
This was a major setback for Henry, but this failure strengthened his position in the long run. He fled to France, where the young French king, Charles VIII, provided him with money, ships, and mercenary soldiers. The French king was looking for an opportunity to destabilize Richard's England. Henry made a brilliant political move. He publicly swore that if he won the throne, he would marry Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. This promise raised hopes of uniting the houses of York and Lancaster and attracted all those who were tired of decades of war. On August 1st, 1485, Henry set sail from France. A week later, on August 7th, he landed at Mill Bay in Wales. Amazingly, he faced no resistance. He took advantage of his Welsh roots, and many local chieftains and common people began to join his army. By August 15, he had entered England. Richard received news of the invasion on August 11th and ordered his army to march towards Leicester. His goal was to stop Henry before he reached London, but instead of heading for London, Henry advanced towards Leicestershire, as he knew his potential allies, the Stanley family, were in that area.
This family held immense power in the northwest, and their support could turn the tide of the battle. The two armies began to gather near Battle of Bosworth, and by the evening of August 21, they were camped a few miles from each other for a battle that was about to change the history of England. For centuries, everyone believed that this battle was fought around Ambion Hill. It was a neat story, taught in books and shown on maps, but there was no solid archaeological evidence to support this story.
Between 2005 and 2009, a major archaeological project changed this entire picture. Experts began searching for a marsh repeatedly mentioned in historical accounts. There was no marsh on Ambion Hill, but scientific analysis of soil samples, which included studying ancient pollen and peat deposits in completely decomposed vegetation, confirmed the presence of an ancient marshy area 2 miles southwest of Ambion Hill. Then came the moment that changed everything. A medieval cannonball was discovered with a metal detector.
This was irrefutable proof. Subsequently, more than 40 cannonballs were found there, the largest collection of medieval cannonballs ever discovered. These finds identified the true epicenter of the battle, where the artillery duel took place. This new research completely redrew the map of the battle. It revealed that Richard's army was not camped on Ambion Hill, but across an old Roman road, where it had access to water for its large army and horses.
Meanwhile, Henry's army was to the west, near White Moors, but there were not 2 but 3 armies on the field. The third and decisive army belonged to the Stanley brothers, Thomas, Lord Stanley, and Sir William Stanley. They were the uncrowned kings of the Northwest and had a large private army of their own. Thomas Stanley was an extremely shrewd politician who always sided with the winner. In this battle, he was in an incredibly difficult position. He had sworn an oath of loyalty to Richard, and his son, Lord Strange, was a hostage with Richard. On the other hand, he was also Henry Tudor's stepfather. He positioned his army on high ground between the two forces, from where he could survey the entire battlefield and make his decision at the right moment. In terms of numbers, Richard had the advantage. He had about 10,000 soldiers and better artillery, while Henry had about 5,000 soldiers, combining French mercenaries and Welsh recruits. But the Stanleys had another 5,000 to 6,000 men. If they joined Henry, the two armies would be evenly matched. Everything depended on Stanley's decision.
The battle began with a roar of artillery. These early cannons were extremely crude and dangerous. Firing them was a specialized art, and they often exploded. The heavy lead balls they fired would bounce off the ground and tear through the ranks of soldiers, causing horrific injuries. Then the infantries clashed. It was hand-to-hand combat, where spears, halberds, and swords were being used.
The halberd was a particularly deadly weapon, featuring a spear point, an axe blade, and a hook used to pull an enemy from his horse or break through his armor. The center of Henry's army was his professional French mercenaries, while Richard's army was led by the experienced Duke of Norfolk. Henry's commander, the Earl of Oxford, showed great skill by maneuvering his troops around the marsh to attack Norfolk's flank, inflicting early losses.
Archaeological evidence also suggests that Richard may have tried to lure a part of Henry's army, especially the French soldiers, toward him to isolate Henry, who lacked battle experience. The battle had been going on for over an hour. Norfolk's contingent was under severe pressure, but a large part of Richard's army under the command of the Earl of Northumberland did not move from its position. He refused to take part in the battle.
Was this open treason? Or was the marshy ground making it difficult to advance? Whatever the reason, it was a devastating blow for Richard. Meanwhile, Richard sent an urgent message to the Stanley brothers to join the battle or his son would be executed. Thomas Stanley's historic reply was, "I have other sons." He refused to be pressured. Now Richard made an extremely bold and dangerous decision. He spotted Henry Tudor's banner on the other side of the field, looking relatively unprotected.
He gathered about 800 of his loyal household knights and personally led them in a furious charge directly at Henry. It was the ultimate medieval gamble: kill the enemy leader and win the battle. Richard was a ferocious warrior. He fell upon Henry's bodyguard like lightning. He personally killed Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, and unhorsed a giant knight, Sir John Chain. For a moment, it seemed he would succeed.
Henry, witnessing battle for the first time in his life, was frozen with fear, but his bodyguards held firm and blunted the force of Richard's attack. Meanwhile, Richard's horse became stuck in the marsh, and he was cut off from his men. This was the moment Sir William Stanley finally made his decision. He launched a devastating attack with his fresh troops on Richard's exposed flank. It was the final blow. Richard, now completely surrounded, refused and offered to flee.
He chose to die fighting like a king. Shakespeare's famous line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," was not a plea for escape, but a desperate cry for a new mount so he could get back into the fight and reach Henry. But eventually he was overwhelmed by enemies and killed. After the battle, Richard's body was desecrated. It was stripped naked, slung over a horse, paraded through the streets of Leicester, and then buried without ceremony in the Greyfriars Church. On the battlefield, it is said that Richard's crown was found in a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head right there. Henry immediately went to London, declared his kingship, and fulfilled his promise by marrying Elizabeth of York the following year, symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses. He founded the Tudor dynasty, which ruled England for 118 years and changed it forever. For centuries, the location of Richard's grave was lost to obscurity.
The Greyfriars Church had been demolished and new buildings were constructed on its site. But in 2012, archaeologists made an incredible discovery. They excavated under a council car park in Leicester and, on the very first day, found a human skeleton. The skeleton had a severe curvature of the spine, a sign of severe scoliosis. It wasn't the ugly hunchback described by Shakespeare, but it matched the historical detail that Richard had one shoulder higher than the other. Then science delivered the final verdict.
Experts traced two living descendants of Richard's sister, Anne of York. Their mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed only from mother to daughter, was compared to the DNA extracted from the skeleton. The result was a 100% match. This was undoubtedly the body of Richard III. Forensic analysis of the skeleton also revealed the horrific details of his death. He had 11 wounds on his body, 9 of them to the head. This indicates that his helmet had fallen off or was removed in the final moments of the fight.
2 wounds on the back of the skull were fatal, indicating he was struck down after he had fallen. Some wounds were inflicted post-mortem, confirming the story of his body's desecration. The Battle of Bosworth was not just about one king replacing another. It was the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, which had lasted over 300 years, and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. It was a turning point that changed the destiny of England, and it was all decided on a battlefield with the death of a king.
Archaeology and modern science not only determined the true location of the battle, but also found a lost king after 500 years, bringing the myths of history down to the solid ground of reality. Near the spot in Leicester where Richard fell, his personal emblem, a small silver boar badge, was found. This small object tells a huge and tragic story of those final moments. In 2015, the last Plantagenet king of England was finally reburied with royal honors in Leicester Cathedral, closing a chapter of history.